Hello, everyone. Welcome to World Affairs. I hope that you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday and that you and loved ones are safe and well in these very difficult times. To make sure you're at the right program, you're joining us now for discussion on the future of U.S.-Korea relations and the Korean Peninsula. This conversation is being held in partnership with the South Korean Consulate of San Francisco. And we also warmly welcome members of the Pacific Council for International Policy who are joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Philip Yun, President and CEO of World Affairs and your moderator for this evening. And today's program features three distinguished panelists, Professor Chaesung Chun, Professor Kathy Moon, and Mr. Scott Snyder. But before we start, I would like to ask our co-host, the Honorable Sang-Soo Yun, the Republic of Korea's Consul General here in San Francisco, who has just arrived just very recently to say a few words for us. Consul General, it's great to have you here. Welcome to San Francisco. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Sang-Soo Yun, and I arrived here in San Francisco 2 weeks ago. And it is my first duty make remarks as a Consul General in public. So it is very much honor to me. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Korean Consulate General in San Francisco, I'd like to warmly welcome all the participants present here today. I thank Moderator Mr. Philip Yun and three distinguished panelists, Professor Catherine Moon, Mr. Scott Snyder, and Professor Chaesung, for sharing your valuable time in this occasion. My special thanks also goes to the staff of the World Affairs Council for successfully organizing this webinar. Today's topic is US-Korea relations going forward. The last 2, 3, and 4 years was full of up and downs in relation to Korean Peninsula. The US-Korean relation continued to be very much solid and strong, but such issues as a defense budget, sharing, role of US forces in Korea, and the North Korean issues has drawn much attention from the many media and public. As you know, the US presidential election is over, and the live broadcast of the election was very much closely monitored by Korean public, because the outcome of election is very important for the Korean-US relation and also for the future of Korean Peninsula. 2 weeks ago, President Moon Jaein and the President-elect Joe Biden had an occasion to talk over the phone and reaffirm the US-Korea alliance. Both sides agreed to closely cooperate on many issues, including the North Korean nuclear issue and also the COVID-19. So we believe that in the coming Biden administration, as always, we will face a lot of new challenges in relation to Korean Peninsula. I believe that the moderator and the three distinguished panelists today will have a very useful and very fruitful discussion on how to make these challenges into new opportunities. So I hope that today's discussion will give us some guidance, kind of guidance and orientation, how to strengthen Korea and US relations, and also the possible future, the peaceful settlement in Korean Peninsula. That's all I can say right now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Consul General Yun. We're most pleased that you've chosen the World Affairs in this particular event to make one of your first official events and remarks. So thank you for those. Now I'm delighted to introduce our panel. First, we have Chaesung Chun, a professor of political science and international relations at Seoul National University. He's also the director of the university's Center for International Security at its East Asian Institute, and he's coming to us from Seoul. He is joined by prominent Korea scholar Kathy Moon of Wellesley College. There, she is a political science professor and the holder of the Wasserman Chair of Asian Studies. Professor Moon is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution for East Asia Policy. And finally, we have my very good and old friend, Scott Snyder. Scott, I've known for many, many years when we were in university together. He's the senior fellow and director of Korean studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. He's written a number of books, including South Korea at the Crossroads, and he's co-author most recently of the Japan-South Korea Identity Clash. So I'd like to thank you all for being with us. It's great to have you here. And so let's get to it. We're in the middle of a presidential transition, as Consul General Yun had talked about. 4 years ago, during that transition, President Obama then warned President Trump that North Korea was going to be the biggest foreign policy challenge early in the new administration, and he was absolutely right. Understanding that we're in the midst of pandemic economic distress, is there the same amount of urgency? Many think that North Korea has a significant amount of incentive to do something provocative in the coming months. So the three of you, do you think that's likely? If so, why? If not, why as well? So Professor Chun, why don't you start and then we'll go around.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be part of this panelist. Well, North Korea problem is very significant because we already witnessed a quite much enhancement of North Korea's nuclear and missile capability. And what we witnessed in the past is that as soon as the new president comes in, take office in the United States, there was a provocation. For example, in 2009, when President Obama first took office, North Korea conducted a long-range missile test in April and a second nuclear test in May. Also in 2017, when President Trump took office, North Korea conducted long-range missile tests less than one month after President Trump became a president. So I think there could be three factors that will affect whether or not North Korea will conduct this kind of provocation. First is that when North Korea's priority in Biden administration's list of foreign policy issues, if that priority is significantly lowered, then there might be a possibility of provocation because, we expect that Biden administration will be so much absorbed in domestic matters such as health issue and economic hardship. So looking back upon what North Korea did after provocation, just after the inauguration, that led to some kind of high-level bilateral talks in 2009, for example, between North Korea and the United States. And also after 1 year of provocation in 2017, that was Singapore summit, as you all know. The second factor will be North Korean economy. So we know that there are a lot of pressures and hardships in North Korean economy. If North Korea's economic situation worsens, then the importance of nuclear negotiation with the United States, for the hope of sanction relief. The crucial goal of Kim Jong-un regime is to stabilize the regime. That's the first and from preeminent purpose of Kim Jong-un's political regime. But currently, trade and foreign currency imports in North Korea are deleted due to the economic sanctions and pandemic effects. And some specialists in South Korea predict that the annual growth rate of North Korea will be -5 or less in this year. So eventually, North Korea economy has no choice but to rely on the market, but the market situation worsens, as we all know. Finally, it's China's policy. China fears the consequence of strengthening of the ROK-US alliance if North Korea provokes. That gives China the reason to restrain North Korea's provocation. So while the prospect that ROK-US alliance will be strengthened by the emergence of the Biden administration, Biden emphasized the importance of alliance so far. So if other elements such as North Korea provocation further strengthens the ROK-US alliance, that will be a bad factor to China. So probably China will restrict North Korea from provocation in consideration of the US-China relations. for the better direction and the change of the RK-US alliance.
So,
Yep.
Professor Kathy Moon, so Kathy, so, I don't mean to put you on a spot. I mean, everything, no one knows exactly what North Korea is doing. Everything is done in terms of probabilities, but if you were betting, what's your read of what may happen over the next few months? Will North Korea do something provocative, or do you think they're going to wait and see? You're on mute.
Since I'm not a betting gal, I'll be able to evade your question, but let me get at it this way. I think the larger question is, if North Koreans conduct a so-called provocative act, what is it and why? Very often, as we already know, those of us who study North Korea, the regime often conducts missile tests, even nuclear tests, partly for domestic consumption and partly because of domestic political stresses, one could say. Even the missile tests that came around the beginning of Mr. Obama's first term, one could argue that it was an outgrowth of domestic tensions and problems and insecurities brought upon by the severe illness of Kim Jong-il, the former leader, the father of Kim Jong-un. So we have to look at any kind of gestures, both good and bad, in both positive and negative ways, or to ask what are the reasons behind them? Are there any opportunities that they present? If they are conducted primarily for domestic consumption reasons, it's best not to overreact. If, on the other hand, it is deliberately an effort to get a certain kind of attention or to throw a wrench into ongoing goodwill, once that's established, then that's a problem. I would also say that North Korea, this is the other part of your question, how urgent is North Korea? It's very urgent for the reasons Professor Chun said. More specifically, we now know that possibly North Korea has much more potent intercontinental ballistic missiles that supposedly might be able to reach the larger landmass of the United States and not just the coast. If those missiles are operable, we don't know for sure whether it was a mock-up or whether it's real. But if it's real, that's a problem. We do know that it is testing, or rather developing very rapidly, the capabilities for a submarine-launched ballistic missile. That would also be bad news if they were to succeed. On the economic front, Professor Chun very carefully laid out some of its big problems, the macro problems. But I think it's a dangerous thing for the United States if we push North Korea more and more into the arms of China. The North Koreans themselves are very, very conscious, very proud of their of not becoming overly dependent on China, but we all know that China is basically the lifeline for North Korea. So the more difficult North Korea's economy gets, the more it might have to go toward China. And I think that is not a situation that we, the United States, would want to help along.
So hold that thought, because
Sure.
I'm going to ask you a question about what the Biden administration should do, because right after this. So Scott, maybe we can have you tell us what you think. There seems to be this narrative, at least from what I'm hearing in Washington, that people think that, there's a good chance North Korea is going to do something. What are you thinking?
Well, I think we've already heard two excellent views on this, and I think that the verdict is still out, and we're waiting to see what North Korea has to say at their 8th Party Congress that's going to be held within the next month. That's really going to be the decision point. A lot of people in the Washington, D.C. area believe that it is in North Korea's DNA to conduct provocations as a way of attracting attention and as a way of shaping the environment of the new leader. But I actually think that there is a set of powerful arguments for why it is not in North Korea's interests to conduct a provocation. One, they've developed their nuclear capability, and to provoke at this point, I think would signal weakness rather than strength that comes from having a deterrent capability. Two, I think that a provocation would put at risk the relationship with China that they've grown increasingly dependent on. And three, that sort of action would magnify the problems that have already been elucidated by Professor Chun and by Kathy on the economic front.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, I find this really interesting because you said the dialogue, the general consensus in Washington and others is that North Korea is going to do something. And in fact, we hear all three of you saying, oh, not so fast. So, Kathy, let's go back to you then. What do you think then the Biden administration will do with respect to North Korea, given what you just said about China and North Korea?
Thanks for that question, Philip. Before I get to that, I want to respond a bit to Scott's comments.
Sure.
That I think an interesting question would be, if North Korea does not do anything provocative in the first 6 months of the Biden administration, what does that mean? Or even in the first year, what might that mean? And to me, that would be a much more interesting question. Because number one, if the North Koreans do something, we have the same tricks in the same bag: sanctions, condemnation, etc., trying to talk to South Korea, China, Japan, which haven't gotten us very far, frankly, in terms of the goal of denuclearization. So if North Koreans stay mum and stay quiet, then is that an opportunity? If so, what do we do about it? As far as the Biden administration's path might be, I think they're going to take time to figure this out in order to come up with a larger strategy. I think Iran will be much more of an urgent matter, rightly so, given the situation that Mr. Trump is leaving us in at this point. But I also think that the Biden administration can take smaller, quiet steps to signal to North Korea that we want to play. We want to play a nice game, if possible, at least at the starting point. One thing I would suggest is to focus on what we might call COVID diplomacy, to try to gauge what might the North Koreans' needs be, not just North Korea regime, but the people's needs, because we really don't know, and the North Koreans have not made it easy for us to find out. If there is anything that the United States can do together with other countries, and especially the larger international community, then that I think would be a very practical, non-threatening opening for principled engagement, for humanitarian considerations being front and center.
Okay, great. So Scott, let's kind of answer the question that Kathy actually posed. I mean, we assume that North Korea isn't going to do anything provocative for right now, or that they're not planning to do something. If you were advising Biden, is there something that we could do in the next month or two to sort of signal intentions? And what should they be doing on the assumption that North Korea doesn't do anything for a while? I mean, Kathy talked a little bit about that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, so what's really interesting is that I feel that a lot of people are almost hoping for provocation because it makes it a lot easier to make policy.
Right.
And so I do think that what Kathy has laid out is actually the more challenging path in a way. I think that a Biden administration is going to want to send signals early that it is open to having a dialogue with the North Koreans on denuclearization. I think the big challenge, though, is that a lot of people who are close to the Biden administration may be tempted to go back to Hanoi to try to reopen that discussion. And to try to simply go step by step and maybe focus on a freeze and getting into Yongbyon. And I'm not sure that the North Koreans, they appear to have foreclosed that option. And so, that is one big challenge is what is going to be the basis and what are the parameters for the dialogue as it would unfold.
Okay, thank you. Professor Chun, as we wait for a Biden administration, we've been hearing different, sort of descriptions about what South Koreans prefer. What is the Moon Jae-in hoping for with respect to U.S. policy towards North Korea? Can you sort of lay that out for us?
Sure, sure. Before that, just one comment. If North Korea doesn't do provocation, but still North Korea is enhancing their nuclear capability, even though they do not provoke. So that enhancement of nuclear capability is a problem. Now we saw the test of hydrogen bomb last year and then ICBM test. Probably they succeeded in realizing the re-entry technology and merge their ICBM, which will be a big threat to the United States. So even though there is no provocative move from North Korea, US should do something. And also related to South Korea, we are watching what will happen the 8th Party Congress at the very first of next year, because Kim Jong-un professed that the last 5-year economic plan failed. That's very exceptional for a North Korean leader. And he accepted that the economic plan failed. And also at the outset of this year, Kim Jong-un said that they will focus on economic revitalization, but which failed because of many unexpected factors. So if Kim Jong-un still focus on economic recovery, then we think that there might be a chance to engage with North Korea. But if Kim Jong-un at the 8th Party Congress revives, for example, the Byungjin plan, which implies that they will refocus on the building nuclear capability and threaten outside powers to induce more economic assistance, that will be a problem. For Moon Jae-in government's perspective, this year in July, Kim Yo-jong issued a statement that if there is some credible step from the United States to guarantee North Korea's region security, then they will resume talk. Actually, which is a retreat from their former position, because they said that they will do some denuclearizing steps if there is a signal from the United States in terms of security guarantee. But now they stopped all the negotiations. So for the entry of to resume the talk, US should do first something. So that's more difficult, but South Korean government knows that there should be some parallel approach between denuclearization and the peace process, or to guarantee North Korea's region security. But if North Korea takes steps to initially denuclearize itself, even though it's some unbelievable step, but we should give something to compensate North Korea in terms of security guarantee, but it's very hard. So that's why President Moon suggested the end of war declaration. That's the first step, and that should be go with the North Korea's denuclearization. But the problem is, can we find any compensation or the steps to give them the credible signal that we will try our best to very concretely to guarantee their security?
Okay, so let's spend a little time on South Korea. We spent a significant amount of time on North Korea. Let's go to South Korea and U.S. Relations. South Korea, like the United States, a lot of domestic issues to contend with. There's the economy, generational divide, income gap. And we know that Moon Jae-in recently proposed the Korean New Deal, I think it was, a plan to jumpstart the economy following the COVID-19, sort of as we get out of that tunnel, and the policy revolves around a number of initiatives and a massive amount of funding laying out in order to do that. The United States, as Kathy Professor Moon had talked about, we're going to be preoccupied not only with Iran and foreign policy, but we have our own economy, we have our own pandemic, and it's much worse than anywhere else. So, Professor Chung, so in your mind, what's your assessment of the US-ROK relationship at this point? And in your mind, did Donald Trump, strengthen it, or did he hurt the relationship in ways?
Well, if I have to pick up one, it hurt.
Okay.
Because, you know, the alliance should be viewed from the perspective of security strategy. But as we all know, that Trump's approach was quite much unconventional. It's a deal-based kind of, you know, alliance management style. So there was a lot of frustrations in South Korea. How can we develop the alliance in terms of North Korean nuclear policy and China policy? There are some people who estimated or the value Trump's approach to North Korean nuclear problem because there was a symmetry, but we wonder if that has any substance. So by having a more comprehensive regional security perspective, then we can develop alliance and we can have an easier approach to management issues such as Afghan transfer or SMA. For the coming U.S.-South Korea relations, I think North Korea will be a focus for Moon administration because next year will be actually the final year of Moon administration. So, and also we have a president's election in March 2022. So next year will be very difficult in terms of managing political situation. And Moon administration will try to have success, which is good in terms of establishing some peace regime. But if South Korea focuses too narrowly on peninsula issue, the Biden administration now in a big change, try to have a more new, comprehensive East Asian security policy. So if there is any discrepancy in terms of level of approach, then I am worried that there might be some differences of views between Moon and Biden next year.
Okay. Just as a reminder, just to let you know, people in the audience, if you have questions, why don't you go ahead and do that? I have the ability to see them and I'll try to weave them into our conversation as best we can. At least that's my understanding. I hope we have that capability. So please feel free, if you want to ask questions to our panelists, to go ahead and put them in and we'll get to them as best we can. So Scott, let me ask you your assessment. Do you agree with Professor Chun? And do you feel like the domestic priorities are ultimately going to hurt or help U.S. ROK relations in general, the relationship?
Yeah, well, I agree with Professor Chun that President Trump used rhetoric that really was not supportive of the alliance. But the paradox is that on the one hand, South Korean public support for the alliance has really never been higher. It's up in the 90s. But at the same time, 96% of Koreans rejected Trump's demands that South Korea pay a lot more for US troop presence. And I actually think that Trump's removal may end up magnifying some areas, some gaps between the US and South Korea now that the US is returning to a more conventional approach toward alliance issues. The burden sharing issue should be easy to resolve, but I think the regional contextual issues could be more challenging. For instance, the US and South Korea, even though we have an alliance, it's focused on North Korea, and we really haven't invested in much discussion or infrastructure about how to deal with China, and there's some differences there. Actually, same thing with Japan. A Biden administration, I think, is going to return to an emphasis on trilateral dialogue among the US, Japan, and South Korea, and they're going to want to see a good Japan-South Korea relationship. And that has been a struggle for the Moon administration. And then, of course, what's really interesting is the kind of other issues like the pandemic creates an opportunity for alliance cooperation that is new and that is striking. And so those kinds of new frontier issues are real opportunities, I think, for both leaders as they respectively grapple with their different kinds of domestic problems.
Okay, so Kathy, if you were advising President Biden, President Biden coming in, what would you suggest to do the United States do to strengthen relations with South Korea?
Well, I think one of the easier, if I may say that, and salient issues very close to President-elect Biden's heart and his entire administration's agenda will be the environment. And that is an issue that South Koreans also care about, and that the Moon administration has come out explicitly as a priority. It's also something China says it cares about, as well as Japan. So perhaps focusing on climate change, the environment, is one area where we might see some opportunity for agreement from multiple parties, and definitely between the two allies, the United States and South Korea. The second issue, and it doesn't mean second in rank in terms of importance, but the second point that I would make is that I think President Moon, it would be to his benefit if he took Professor Chun's advice and not have a myopic view of peninsular issues and inter-Korean peace as the showcase issue that he wants to end his administration on. First of all, that isn't going to happen. I don't think he can realistically expect a positive legacy with a real deal of any kind in the very short time he has left in his term, and also given the mess of an alliance relationship and regional tensions that exist in East Asia. So realistically speaking, I would suggest he let go of the peninsular issues as the priority and rather focus on values that the United States cares about and that other East Asian neighbors like Australia, Japan, and other democracies care about. And that means focusing on strengthening democracies, not only in South Korea, but serving as a rhetorical and practical supporter of democracy promotion and strengthening in Asia in particular. This is something today, Mark Napper, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, spoke at the Los Angeles World Affairs Council in a seminar. And just today, this morning, he came on the record saying that he would really like to see, the US would like to see South Korea and Japan, the two very close allies in East Asia, quote, stand up to China, call out its bad behavior, its aggressions, etc., bullying, etc. And China has been bullying South Korea as well as Australia. We know that. So I think this is an opportunity that I would hope South Koreans can take more seriously, especially since their own democracy, their own recent history is built on fighting for democratization and human rights. The one other thing I would like to throw out, and particularly perhaps Professor Chun might be able to give us some enlightenment on this. I am very concerned about this rhetorical escalation, maybe escalation is too strong a term, but rhetorical highlighting of possibly developing or desiring nuclear sovereignty in South Korea, an independent nuclear arsenal by Koreans for South Koreans, or even this notion that both the Conservative Party and the Centrist Party, the opposition parties, have put out about possibly nuclear sharing with the United States. This kind of talk would be a deal breaker in many ways in terms of strengthening the alliance. So I'd like to know Professor Chun's thoughts on what is going on in South Korea. We know that people might be signaling things or sending up trial balloons, partly toward China, partly toward the US, but how seriously should we consider this, or should the Biden administration consider this?
So you read my thoughts. That's great. So Professor Chun, why don't you answer Professor Moon's question? But let me put a kicker in here. We know that my old colleague Ambassador Lee Soo-yeok said some things about the U.S. ROK relationship, and we know there's a question here that was given to us about Moon Jaein and his comments about the U.S. South Korea relationship. how does that all play together? I'll let you decide what you want to answer, but there's a lot of interesting issues here related to that.
Sure, sure. Well, there are diverse views inside South Korea about foreign policy and North Korea policy. First, South Korea's possibility of going nuclear. There was an address by now Deputy Secretary Began in last July in Michigan University, and he opened his address by saying that if the United States withdraw some kind of nuclear umbrella from the South Korea, then South Korea will go nuclear, and then there will be a nuclear equipment of Japan, which will be followed by the enhancement of Chinese nuclear capability. So by looking at the security logic, if there is a weakening of the US commitment to extended deterrence to South Korea when North Korea now developed, ICBM or hydrogen bomb, then we should have our own ways of deterring North Korea's nuclear attack. And also North Korea can use nuclear weapons to decouple South Korea from United States in terms of security guarantee. For example, if North Korea threatens the United States, if United States assists South Korea when North Korea attacks South Korea, then North Korea will attack California with MIRV ICBM nuclear missiles, for example. Then there will be a realization of decoupling. So I think all the background of this argument comes from the debate about the continuing commitment of the US-RK alliance. If there is any hint that US will withdraw some commitment from from South Korea for any reason, for example, if South Korea tilts towards China, or if South Korea approach to North Korea in terms of peace treaty, then US might withdraw USFK or nuclear commitment. If that kind of thinking looms large in South Koreans' mind, then there will be that kind of argument of going nuclear. But generally, there is a survey that 70% of South Koreans, almost 70%, agree to the idea of going nuclear, but it's up to how we ask survey questions. For example, if we develop nuclear weapons in spite of US opposition, then still are you willing to develop nuclear weapons? Then I think the percentage will go down substantially. So my conclusion, short-term conclusion is that as far as we have a strong RK-US alliance, if US reaffirms their commitment to nuclear, the umbrella to South Korea, I think only minority which expects some kind of weakening of the extended deterrence will talk about going nuclear. And also about the future of RK-US alliance, there is a frustration in South Korea that in 2018, there was some superficial move from North Korea to denuclearize itself, like we have witnessed in Punggye-ri and Dongchang-ri, but there was not really a move from US side in terms of positive incentive from US. So there was some frustration. So we have to do something. So if alliance doesn't support that kind of South Korea's move toward peace regime, then we should talk more. That kind of mentality, I guess. But as Scott said, in terms of general support for the alliance, South Korea's national preference for the US is more than 70 or 80%, which is very high. By contrast, the national preference for China is 7 or 8%, according to the recent survey from EAI. So it's incomparable.
Okay, great. Thank
Philip,
you.
can I just weigh in on just 2 points that I wanted to add to this discussion? One, this has been a focus because the conservative opposition party leader, Kim Jong-un, basically recently suggested that South Korea should pursue a nuclear option. And he was very much signaling under the condition that the Biden administration drops denuclearization as the objective in policy toward North Korea. And so that is a comment that is targeted at Biden, and it's also targeted at Moon. And it's really designed to stiffen the U.S. ROK position on the issue of denuclearization. But the second point is that I think that for the Biden administration coming in, there's a lot of people in the non-proliferation community who see that North Korea's missile and nuclear developments were simply not responded to from an extended deterrence perspective during the Trump administration. And so I do think that there will be an effort on the part of a Biden administration non-proliferation community to engage in a much more robust dialogue with South Korea and Japan in an effort to shore up extended deterrence, to show the credibility of extended deterrence. And some of that also involves looking at the way that the US works with NATO and figuring out if there are ways to borrow some of these practices, especially in terms of consultations regarding nuclear deterrent capabilities.
Okay, thanks. So I want to cover, Scott, you good segue. I want to talk a little bit about Japan, and then there are a couple of questions about China that I would like to try to get to as quickly as possible. This is, we all never have enough time. So Japan, it's, another key element really of the US ROK relationship is the balance of, balancing relations with Japan, trilaterally and also bilaterally. And I guess it's safe to say that relations between South Korea and Japan could be a lot better. Some have argued that it's probably as bad as it's been in a very long time. And so, Kathy, maybe I can ask you, should this be a high priority of the Biden administration? And, what role can the U.S. play in sort of, somehow, do we want to be a go-between? How can we promote a better relations between what seems to be, in my mind, two very important allies?
Yeah, Philip, to me, this is a real knotty question. And I have studied both Korean and Japanese nationalisms quite a bit. I personally think this hyper-nationalist stuff just has to stop. It's basically holding Korea-Japan relations hostage, and by extension, aspects of the larger alliance relationships among the three countries, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. No, I don't think the Biden administration should try to mediate so much. I think the Biden administration should lay down really clear terms of what Washington expects from these two allies in return for a more normal alliance relationship, more consultation in every way. Scott already alluded to the nuclear issue or aspects. Also, to have a more rationalized discussion about cost sharing for the U.S. troop presence in both countries, but especially South Korea, and Biden has already taken that step in his October, I don't know if it's an op-ed but news article letter to the Korean people in the Yonhap News of South Korea. He used the word the extortionary, I believe. He referred to the Trump administration's behavior towards South Korea regarding the U.S. troop presence, which is a big part of the alliance relationship. Biden referred to Trump's actions as extortionary. And so that will stop with the Biden administration. And so I think the Biden administration should be very clear what the U.S. is willing to offer consistently, but also demand that Korea and Japan get over this historical memory conflict, because it has been going on way too long, and the Obama administration spent a lot of energy hand-holding both countries, both governments, about coming to the table to talk. And we know that Tony Blinken, if he becomes the new Secretary of State, is very familiar with these issues about history, the colonial era, the Japanese, etc. And, you know, I don't know if he's going to be willing to allow round 2 or even 3, if you think about the first 2 administrations of the Obama administration, to have the Japan-Korea historical problems sabotage or hold hostage areas of potential progress and improvement.
Okay, Professor Chun, South Korean side, would South Korea welcome some kind of mediation? What do you think the Moon Jae-in government wants? Where do you think the body politic of the South Korean people are on this? And, you know, what's your assessment?
Sure, sure. I personally welcome U.S. intervention or advice to cure the relations between South Korea and Japan. But the real problem is that I think China policy of South Korea and Japan is not identical. For example, I saw a South Korean newspaper a report showing that there was a demonstration in Tokyo supporting Trump because Trump signifies some confrontational policy toward China. So there is a lot of views to support confrontational approach to China because there is a maritime territorial problem between China and Japan. And also Japan finds a momentum to develop their military power to cope with Chinese military rise. That's understandable. For South Korean side, South Korea is much more vulnerable to Chinese economic retaliation, and China is a big part of the peace process for Korean Peninsula. So by having a better relations with China for the short term, South Korea can achieve a foreign policy goals. So this difference should be the goal of Biden administration's foreign policy if they want to have a reconciliation between South Korea and Japan. To do that, Biden should have some kind of view of division of roles between South Korea and Japan to deal with China. South Korea might do something to engage with China, which is not appeasement, but try to change Chinese behavior based on the common norms between South Korea and the US. And also, Japan can do something to militarily balance against China. Even though South Korea should do something to develop our own military power to deal with these regional uncertainties. And the other one is there is always a political temptation in South Korea and Japan to make a linkage between the history issue and security and economic issue to enhance their own domestic political interest, both South Korea and Japan. For example, Park Geun-hye administration said that there will be no negotiation in any issue without having some progress in comfort women issue, for example. And Abe administration tried to link these historical issues with the economic issues. You know, as we all know, the semiconductor material prohibition, that kind of thing. So, and also we reacted with GSOMIA, which is, I think, it's really not a very good idea. You know, to make a linkage and evading two-track policy between history and his security issues.
So Scott, you co-authored a book on sort of the U.S. on the Korean Japanese identity issue. Anything you want to add based on what you've written?
Sure. In a word, I guess that our message was that Japan and South Korea need statesmanship from their leaders. Yeah. And that means placing the national interest above domestic challenges. And the real problem is that in the 5 years since our book came out, I think that Japan-Korea issues have become even more entangled in domestic politics on both sides than they were before. And so I'm not very optimistic about solving those issues, the history issues. I think they can be managed, and I really appreciate Kathy mentioning Tony Blinken's previous role because he actually regularized a Deputy Secretary of State trilateral meeting with South Korean and Japanese counterparts that subsequently fell to the wayside under the Trump administration. And so I personally would love to see the US reestablish that dialogue at an early stage, because I think that it did help to stabilize the environment for a good, a stable Korea-Japan relationship.
So we've got about maybe 7 or 8 minutes before we have to be closed. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So Scott, let's talk about regional and China, okay? I mean, because it's sort of this big thing, US. You know, relations between US and China, you know, are arguably at their lowest point in generations. You got, you know, the trade issues, South China Sea, COVID-19, you know, Hong Kong and Uyghurs. You know, people are expecting that the administration policy is going to produce less tension, but it's basically, is there the same dynamic? And there's a worry by some that we're forcing countries like, South Korea and others in the region to basically take sides. Is that something that you're worried about? You know, where is, what is your view on what we should be doing sort of regionally with the Korean Peninsula in mind?
Okay, well, there's no question that we've entered a period where the US-China relationship is more competitive. I think that in contrast to this past few months with the Trump administration, where the policy has been to demonize China, that in a Biden administration will focus on competing where we must and cooperating where we can. So there will be space for cooperation, but on the values issues and on the normative issues related to order and a rules-based approach versus a power-based approach to settling regional issues, I think that the US can and should work with allies to create boundaries for China's egregious behavior and try to establish a normative basis for managing issues in the region.
So, Professor Chun, so, you know, we talked about this, about how Koreans feel. I mean, their relationship, their feeling towards the United States seems to be, at least among younger people, is very positive. China is quite negative. You know, we have, again, the comments of people about, you know, maybe South Korea will not necessarily choose the United States. Is this a concern for you?
Sure, yeah. Taking side is a big issue in South Korea. And also there is a asking from both China and the United States, you know, at the end of each conference among the scholars, then at the end of the conference, Chinese or American scholars ask very directly, so on which side are you? That's very hard to answer. But I think South Korea government's position and general public's position is that we take positions, not taking sides. So we try to maximize our national interests on each issue, but I think that is not sustainable in the long term. In that sense, you know, Biden administration's new approach to China based on alliance, multilateralism, and norms is very appealing to South Korean public, because we generally, I personally think that value liberal international order in which every state try to value, you know, multilateral way of decision making, you know, focus on human rights and market economy with some freedom and also all those real values for democracy. But we don't know what kind of governance China will pursue if they have enough power to secure their spheres of influence. So we will see. But the problem is that to having norms is okay, but to transforming norms to rules is different, because rules should be very specific. We agree to the US-led norms, for example, but when we talk about real concrete rules, for example, there was a Chinese economic retaliation afterthought, but we have to have a rule to guide which action is really economic retaliation, which is very, you know, not clear. Is this a retaliation? Is this some kind of just economic policy? So we have to do our best to protect our common interest, to have a really a good rules. There are not many areas in which there are already explicit rules. So there are gray zones. So the gray zone operations, as we talk in the security issues. So we have to cooperate much more intensely to found norms. And also North Korea issue again, when there was a Obama Xi Jinping, consensus about developing, new type of great power relations, which is a kind of old concept right now. But they agreed to the idea that North Korean issue will be one in which U.S. and China can cooperate in terms of non-proliferation, because China should stick to the idea of non-proliferation. So South Korea try to make full use of North Korean problem as an opportunity to probably provide some kind of springboard to facilitate any cooperation between U.S. and China. I don't know if it's possible, but there is some kind of, thinking in South Korea in that way.
All right, Professor Moon. Kathy, you have the last word and the last question related to this. I mean, some argue that the stability of Northeast Asia, and really depends on the U.S. role in Asia and its role in Northeast Asia overall. I mean, there are people in the United States that, there's been arguments like this for the last 20 years about U.S., needs to retrench, needs to withdraw. There's concern about this. What do you think? I mean, how do you see then the U.S. role and rationale for being in the region, and and how does that relate to the Korean Peninsula in your mind? This is a sort of a big picture question for you to take as you wish.
Sure, thank you, Philip, and to the person who sent in the question. And I'll try to answer that along with your question that you fielded to the other two speakers. So I think one simple way to get at your earlier question and the questioner's question is to plea for or advocate a multilateral approach by the Biden administration, which we already know that it's the professionals who will be manning the Biden administration in the foreign policy and defense sector, that they are professionals, they are experts, especially with a lot of expertise in East Asia, Pacific related issues. So I feel pretty confident that we will go in the right direction, and the right direction being a multilateral approach to dealing with problems in the region. It is a fact that the only two large-scale multilateral trade agreements, free trade agreements, took place in East Asia or concerning East Asia Pacific countries. As the panelists know, the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes Southeast Asia as well as other Pacific nations, and also the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, the alphabet soup here. And the US is obviously out, not even a player in either of these two processes. We were a leading partner in trying to get the TPP passed, and then the Trump administration completely reneged. So I think we need to get back to the table in working with other countries to work on multilateral agreements that can increase economic and other opportunities and security for the many. That is one way to deal with a Chinese assertiveness, that's what we want to call it. It's another way to prevent the squeezing of our allies in East Asia, particularly South Korea and Japan. If we go to the table together with them and with China on certain issues, as Scott mentioned, where we cooperate when we can for mutual interest reasons. So I would say that the Biden administration, to me, can offer so many different opportunities for collaboration and cooperation in a way that we just did not see in this outgoing administration of Donald Trump. So that I would like to focus is a ray of hope. And on the other hand, I think in terms of dealing with China, when there are the bad actor issues, for example, violating UN sanctions against North Korea in quite serious ways, as we know China has been doing, as well as the outrageous behavior toward Hong Kong and other examples we can easily come up with. Those are times when the United States, together with our allies and friends, need to put our feet down and say absolutely clearly that this is unacceptable. And that's where both norms and rules, as Professor Chun focused on, need to be in play. I'll end there.
Okay, so thanks. You know, we could go on for much longer. I appreciate that, and I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions. But let me just you know, be respectful of people's time. Let me just say thank you to Consul General Sang-Soo Yun. A special thanks to our panelists, Chaesung Chun, Professor of Seoul National University, Kathy Moon, Professor at Wellesley College, Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, both of whom are on the East Coast, so it's rather late, and Professor Chun, who's in Seoul, Korea. We're honored that all of you could join us today. Thank you very much. I also wanted to thank our partners for today's program, the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in San Francisco, the Pacific Council on International Policy. And to those of you who listened in today, we want to thank you. We hope you enjoyed the program. Just want to let you know, please join World Affairs this Thursday, December 3rd at noon Pacific, for a program on how America went from the I to the We Society and back again, with Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, and Shailin Romney Garrett. It's a fascinating book. I hope that you can join us. And so with that, you can RSVP on our website. And so have a great rest of the day. Megan, if you're listening, if you could keep us all on board, I'd like to sort of touch base with our panelists. And to all of you who've been here, thank you again. Please be safe and well in this very difficult time. Thank you.